to 3D is being translated and what that translation actually gives us. If we're reading it in terms of potential material deposition, that would have to speak about a certain kind of continuity of neighboring rules. That is something that we need to evaluate. We can't have, let's say, floating voxels, because those would die off. So even like an idea of translation of some of these growth logics in an analytical way, I think would be interesting. So, I mean, overall, I think that there's a good overview of what's going on. With the game of life strategies and things like that, I think we need to also introduce rule sets that exhibit things like gliders and other strategies. So I think the grid setup should be a bit more expansive so that we can see some of these things naturally progress. So I think when we look at the Conway's rules, we know that there are tendencies of different kinds of behaviors. What that actually means in terms of an interpretation, I think is important to understand. Because, for example, the glider looks like it's something that's moving because it has a self-replicating system that's basically making it move along a trajectory on the grid. But as soon as we try to take that as a behavior that we would translate into geometry, which is really what all of the CA 25 by 25, 9 by 9, I think 40 by 40, this means something totally different. So there should be an idea of distribution and a seeding point that then would trigger a kind of growth process. Does that make sense to you guys?
So you mean we need to find the relationship between the divided cell?
I mean, I think that we need to start to think about relationships, because the implications of a lot of the algorithms, like what you showed in your conclusion slide, have very different potentials. So, for example, when I see the DLA research that you guys were doing and some of the more slime mold simulations and things, those have a particular way of organizing cell-to-cell relationship, which are primarily as much communication as they are formal. The CAs as well could be used as a communication model, or it can be used as a translation into literally like a voxel material logic that could be 3D printed or any of these other things. So I think we need to be able to evaluate things that give us possibilities, like, are the neighborhoods consistent? Are they creating certain neighborhood relationships which are controlled? You talked about symmetry. We know that there is a relationship between symmetry, and we also know that there's a need for symmetry breaking. And so we should try to explore some of these strategies and think which one gives us the most flexibility. But because you have, let's say, 3 or 4 different parallel strands, at some moment we should try to evaluate either strategies that could be more hybrid, and these are things that you can talk with Mustafa, or take decisions that we don't need a DLA system and an L system in a generic sense. So where would we put more value into it, and based on what reasons? The communication part, I think, is very important, because that goes back to the conversation about not building the diagram. So I think that you guys have done, I think, a good general research. I think, for example, the swarm strategies with the Boyd's principles and all of that, these are all, I think, very important, because, Boyd's principles are the basic agent-based parameters that we start off with. So this has, I think, a good responsive strategy to things. But you guys have talked about cell division, and a whole series of other things, which I think it would be interesting to try to think about how we can start to spatialize some of these things and think about those organizations a bit. How do we evaluate it? How would we translate it? Like if you ask me, are these simulations of Earth? You know, this would have a great deal of abstraction to see it relative to some of the research that you guys presented to me last week, right? So working towards the 11th of March, we need to kind of take some decisions about how these worlds are coming together. Not trying to simulate each other, but why we potentially may look for certain flexibility computationally, or certain ideas of growth. Some of it may be more directed to material properties, or some of it may be much more in terms of the ability to deal with much more complex organizations. So I would keep working with the experiments, but I would be looking for certain opportunities where you can utilize some of the behaviors that you're seeing in 2D distribution systems, potentially 3D distribution systems in swarm logics and game of life, and see how those are really working with some of the DLA and the CA strategies that you guys are looking at in terms of growth. So what triggers growth, what limits growth, how can that growth be internal, like subdivision strategies or cell division strategies, how it can be external in terms of introducing new seeds. So we can try to start to see these different thematics just being cataloged in the same way that you're working on it. Okay? I think it's a good start. But I think we need to be able to speak to some of this stuff in a more compressed way, curated way. Because, for example, you guys presented for a half hour. If I combine the last presentation and this presentation, you guys will be talking for a long time. So it's good that this material is there. Just try to consolidate it a little bit more. And then as you guys are seeing possibilities, even more intuitively, in terms of some of the things that you're seeing, I think these are kind of important to discuss with Mustafa. Like, ask Mustafa in terms of non-linear approaches to this, what his recommendations would be. What's the benefit of using an L system versus a DLA system? So that you guys can start to talk about a little bit how some of those translations could happen. Okay? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, Sil. Actually, I have a question. Actually, we already have some hybrid and multiple growth strategy, like the page 40, yeah, like the purple grids. This system actually was designed by us. I mean, like the game of life, like the Conway's game of life. I think he mainly discussed about the space and with the cells. And in this new simulation, we added the energy and the neighborhood, I mean the environment, as a strategy into this whole system. And we, in the first steps, we try to want to utilize some other already existing strategies to mainly to utilize their strengths to make a hybrid strategy, make a hybrid simulation. I want to ask, is this method have some potential?
Yes, no, I think you have a lot of potential. And I did see that you're starting to work on this hybridity. I thought the energy is an important feature, right? Because we're talking about these things actually evolving over time, introducing energy. Energy is important in terms of how we think about life and all of these strategies. I think it's a good start. But understand, like, so for example, what you're doing here is primarily 2D, yes?
Yeah.
And some of the other kind of strands of computational research are primarily 3D growth systems. So what we need to learn is like, well, how do we even start to bring these two worlds together? What I want is to always think in hybrids. So for example, the voxel grid here is something that allows us to think in a 2D and a 3D matrix. When we introduce the concept of 4D is the concept of time. So we know all of these things are changing in time. So even when we select a state, that state is a moment in time, right? In the 3D growth, for example. Some of them find some closure, some limits. Other ones continue to grow, sometimes forever, right? You see some of these kind of almost like exponential growths with some of these behaviors because they continue a pattern of self-replicating. So how do we control these things? How do we make some of these things meaningful? Well, we need to first be aware about those things. So I think what you are doing here, I think, is very important and powerful. I'm just basically suggesting that all of the things that you guys have done up till now are starting to give you a good sensibility about this. Just look for opportunities. You know, you can achieve sometimes the similar results with the different complex algorithms. So, for example, the way that I see DLA and L system, both of them can kind of achieve very similar results. I see DLA system maybe a bit more powerful because it doesn't have a default linear kind of strategy of growth, which is much more like branching system and things like that. But of course, you can do much more complex L system strategies. So both can be very powerful, but they also have some very specific tendencies. So DLA system for me is really a communication system. It's really about seeing how those individual cells come together. That's why it's used a lot for simulation of slime mold and things like this. It's about these kind of superorganism strategies. There's something powerful about that, but it may be very different from your CA and game of life growth models. So it's more about trying to understand them together. You don't have to combine all of the things. It's just to understand the differences of how they are working and see opportunities to hybridize. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
So I think that there's a lot of potential here. You know, the reality of the potential, though, is also based on some of the decisions. As soon as we say that something is going to have a material property, that changes, right? So, for example, if we were using the voxelization and we said, you know what, we're really interested in multi-material printing, then the way that we would codify those voxels would be based on material. And that material may have different properties and other things. So we would introduce different rule sets for that, or a different idea of codification of those kind of voxel aggregations. So there are a lot of things that we can do. I think right now it's important just to think about the 2D, 3D, and 4D relationships. And I would see it as a single seed growth strategy and multiple seed growth strategies, and see how they negotiate. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's very clear.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's nice to see that. But you guys should just tell me, let's just show the presentations, Theo. So maybe you get some more sleep, but I think realistically, we should try to aim to keep the presentations around 20 minutes. Okay, is there another team that wants to show stuff? You don't have to. I wasn't even clear that everybody wanted to, so. Would another team like to show what they've been working on?
The truth is that we were not prepared for a presentation, unfortunately, but we have
you don't have to.
some thoughts that we could share, like more in an informal way, maybe, just to get some feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you guys you have to understand from my side, like, the reason I started showing other stuff was just for clarification about agents and those kind of things, because I heard that there was well, not that I heard it. It seemed obvious, like there were some things that needed to be clarified. If you guys want to show stuff, it's totally fine to do that. If you're going to have another presentation with Mustafa tomorrow about these things, I think that that's totally fine too. You don't need to. So if you have something prepared and you want to show it, I'm happy to give feedback on it. If not, I mean, next week we'll do that as well. So as you guys like. If you want, please feel free to share. But don't feel like it's an obligation, like you don't have to do that.
If it's not a problem that it's not a very organized presentation, I'm just...
No, it's not a problem. I guess the only thing I would ask is, let's try to focus on things that you guys would want feedback on. Does that make sense?
So I can share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. We just try to do some work organizing our previous examples in diagrams and trying to evaluate the information and try to make it easier to understand. So I will just go quickly through all these. They're related to the previous presentation that we did actually, but yeah, it's important to understand. We wanted to focus to water as a different phenomena as we can see it in a very simple way. So it's water as solid. We could say that the simplest thing is the snowflake or the iceberg. As a liquid, it is a droplet or the wave, and as a gas, it could be the steam or the cloud. So we have the different formation factors for each one, and the different computational framework also. We have seen all these things.
So for example, Daphne, that kind of logic, when you say you have a different computational frameworks, are you guys trying to set up a strategy like we said in terms of, how generate a snowflake strategy would be different from atmosphere?
Yeah, this was it was quite confusing for us. So we started focusing on phase changing in general. I can go quickly to the simulation part, to the computational part.
Sure.
First, the first set of simulations, we just try to experiment very in more free way with all the different softwares and explore the different potentialities. So we explored Maya and Bifrost and Particle, and Houdini for fluid dynamic simulation and ocean tools. And we saw the different tools that we could use according to this. But it was obvious that Houdini was offering much more. It was much more powerful regarding the particle population. So we were able to experiment with bigger scales. But so we started exploring different scales, like a drop, a simulation of a drop in Maya. If anyone wants to jump in and add something.
So looking at things like surface tension that you're showing there and its impact on.
We were looking at the different attributes and properties of water. At first, we were looking in both scales, the small scale, the molecular, and then the big scales also. But we were looking through, we were studying how we can use those softwares to study these properties. So,
I mean, I think some of the things, like, I think it's good that you guys are like using softwares in a more of a search space, right? Just trying to see like some of the things that can be done. And I think that that's a good thing to be able to test different things within different platforms. And these things are interesting. I think the thing that would be important is to qualify actually what we're looking at. So, for example, if we're looking at surface tension, you know, for example, here you're talking about bifrost and object stickiness, what those implications actually are, right? That kind of can translate into viscosity, right? In terms of sticky value, and what does that actually mean? And in the context of fluid dynamics, it's pretty clear what this means. In the context of water, it may have very particular things, like when we're talking about super cool strategies and things like that. You know, these kind of fluid dynamic strategies, I think, are other ways of exploring stuff. So you're going to try to find ways of just exploring this from very different perspectives, like particles versus like surface mesh kind of definitions, and trying to get a sense of actually how these engines are working and what is a product of that stuff. I think the thing is, like, at the moment, it's probably more important not that you replicate the same experiments in each of the platforms, but to really try to, I think, maybe look at the diagram that you had, which I think is really powerful, which is like you had the snowflake, you had like this iceberg thing and all of this other stuff. And ask yourself, what is the organizational logic between each of those that we would try to simulate differently, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that diagram where you said we're confused about, I think, is the diagram that should try to clarify what's the principles within each of those that would help us to try to understand. So when I see the snowflake thing, I see it very strong in terms of generative geometries. Obviously, they're primarily two-dimensional, but they're really like a generator. Right? The idea of the snowflake that's very unique is that particular thing can basically generate a principled way of thinking about growth and thinking about pattern. So it's different than recursive fractals. It has a different logic that's more specific, and it's driven primarily because that is interfacing with temperature and atmosphere, which makes it into a really three-dimensional environment that have kind of more 2.5D attributes. When we're talking about vapor and atmosphere, you know, the way that you choose to represent that too, that can be much more about particles and stickiness, but they're much more free, right, in terms of their ability to move around, which is different from how you guys are looking at ice, which is much more, you know, even from just the nano aspect of the things that you guys were showing. And just to think a little bit about maybe how some of those things can potentially play a role in terms of formations.
Yeah, these were very initial experiments. So yes, after that, we tried to organize our thinking about the computational part. And this diagram could be also a discussion. So trying to diagram water with the three different strategies that we could address in the computational part. Firstly, as a material, where we could address phase change and basic water behaviors using, as we will see later, because we have other simulations too, using flocking systems and using Maya and particle engine. So we tried to enter this first phase of this first strategy one, and this could have as a goal to create a digital material and to ask how we could augment these behaviors. I don't know if this is right. We could discuss that. And how a second strategy could be how water interacts and how water is adaptive. So this could go to a strategy of fluid dynamics. and fluid dynamic simulation. And as a third strategy, we could address water as a container. Because water also contains, we could say that water contains other things like sediments, minerals, microorganisms, plankton. So we could combine these two strategies and form and use somehow this like salt or sediments to print as a life to be print. I don't know.
Yeah, if you go back to the diagram, my suggestion would be like water interacting and water as containers seems to me as potentially being things that you guys can, when you start to take decisions about how you're utilizing it, and that's going to be something which is much more having to deal with the implications about its material presence. I think those two things, I would say, I would put them as something that you would do after you come to terms with water as material. Meaning, I don't think that these things have to be worked on in parallel at the same time. What I would suggest is that you just focus on water as material, because your phase-changing properties have three very radical manifestations of state, right? The frozen, which is very rigid, the fluid, which obviously deals with, the dynamics of the aformal in some sense, or non-formal. And the other one is the vapor, which is speaking to it in terms of moisture and atmosphere. So even in the subject of materiality, just on the issue of phase change and behavior, that has potentially three radically different kinds of strands to it. So, for example, the crystallization of ice, or the idea of thinking about atmosphere and the relationship between vapor as a kind of airborne strategy, has also a very different condition to the environment. So I would suggest that you would just focus on that for this next 10 days, let's say a week, 2 weeks, because I think that is probably the thing that would help to take the decisions about things later on. So I would suggest that really that very early diagram, the one that you showed me, where you have the snowflake, you have the fluid tidal thing. Mm-hmm. If you go back, do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, like I really think that this is a really interesting thing, because actually I like it even better that you call it water phenomenon instead of water as material. Because I think what it means is some sense that the phenomenon is really tied to its environment, which is going to be probably more important in a simulation world, because potentially artifacts of its architecture could be an iceberg or it could be a cloud. And I also think that those two are just on complete other ends of the spectrum of its materialization. But it's also so fundamental in terms of looking at it. Like I could look, vertically down like snowflake iceberg and see that as a world of trying to look at that correlation. And I could see droplet wave and steam and cloud. So I just think that this page for me, I think, is very important. I would take this and then say, well, what is the tool and process of simulation that would be applied to these things? And what are the opportunities to see that differently? Because snowflake and iceberg are still solid states, but they're dealing with different organizational values and different and that has to do with distribution, right? In terms of, and the same thing, droplet and wave, for example, droplet demonstrates surface tension in a more 2.5D way. So that's why if you look at a droplet, you'll see that the surface tension will make it into almost like an Anish Kapoor kind of Chicago sculpture, it's a more 2.5D strategy because it's dealing with surface tension, while wave or any kind of body of water, surface tension works only at a particular scale. Like if you look at insects, you see them that they could basically walk on water because their proportions relative to that kind of plane of mass is different. So, but that changes also with viscosity. So if you look at non-Newtonian fluids, for example, like cornstarch, that's when people can walk on water, or when they run, that's because of impact on this kind of cornstarch makes them actually do a kind of space jamming thing. So I would just take this slide in particular and say, okay, what are my computational tools to work on that? And it's pretty clear, like one is more fluid dynamics, one is definitely more kind of Houdini particle strategies of simulation of vapors. And I think it's not a bad thing, the way that you guys have been working, playing with the different softwares. But I would just be tasked with conceptualizing them within those bands.
Yeah, we did some tries to simulate the different phases.
Yeah, I think if you say phases, then most of us are going to think like you're trying to visualize a cloud. Right? Is that part of the thing? Why he's asking you to diagram it?
Not sure I understood the question.
No, I'm asking, like, so when you say that you're trying to visualize the phase changes, what does that mean?
It's more about the behavior internally, how they behave in each phase from gas to solid. Yeah. So we're looking at it in terms of the bonds, for example, between particles.
Yeah, I think that's working at one scale of resolution. Then when you look at things like surface tension, or you looking at things like, by the compacting of the bonds, you can get something that's more solid, right? So those are things that you know. And then as soon as you start to introduce other factors and you start to introduce it more in terms of phenomenon, those simulations can be done in different ways, right?
Yeah, like for now, we simulated the different phases using like the attribute of heat. Okay, so this is just a study, a flocking simulation, or what it is, and using the N particle in Maya. So we understand that there are three simple rules that governs what is a flocking simulation. And
but if I asked you, for example, a flocking simulation would be a good, it's basically agent-based design 101, right?
Yeah.
Now the difference between flocking simulation and now water phenomena, I'm not sure that there is a direct correlation there. Like I don't see it immediately. Maybe there's a reading for it, but let's say, for example, it doesn't have to have a direct correlation right now, because this could be an attitude towards thinking about distribution. Like when I look at the rules of how, let's say, that iceberg comes into formation, that would be a strategy to ask, right? How does the iceberg form? And that formation would be very different, for example, in terms of then, well, how does the cloud form? Even if there is a certain consistency, one is a kind of explicit form, the other one is an amorphous one. One is very contingent to the environment, the other one is very much defined by it. So the contingency means that the variables really change, but the iceberg doesn't really change radically, because at some moment in time, it will melt in terms of temperature change, but that will be a slow process. A cloud is much more variable and transformative. So even how it responds to an environment because of its phase change is something that's important, because the iceberg resists in a way. The cloud doesn't resist. The cloud is much more fluid. It's almost like water in some sense. So there's a gradation from vapor to fluid to solid, which you can kind of see, and that's an interesting one in terms of the ways that you guys think about this. And then there's always those moments which get captured because that process is accelerated. And you guys showed some examples of that. Like when things are freezing, it's always from the outside in. And you get those kind of like strange icicles that are growing upwards and all this other kind of stuff. So I think that you guys can see from those kind of phenomenon certain features that you can be really curious about and try to see how those things are forming or self-forming based on those principles. I think it's good that you're doing the flocking studies and things like that, but I don't know what it means in terms of your water phenomenon right now.
We try to use particle-based. When we try to use particle-based simulation, it's because we're looking at the chemical structure of water. So, like such as iceberg, it actually has a hexagonal chemical structure, and the molecule is actually combined with one oxygen and two oxygen with certain angle. So if three molecules combine, so it's become snowflake chemical structure naturally. And when it turns to six combined together, it's kind of like the example we showed earlier. So it's it's kind of have different behavior. So when six molecules combine together, it becomes the ice spike. So it's kind of changed another form.
Yeah, no, I think that's clear. I think the things that I'm suggesting is like with the previous theme too, I could have said, that the Boyd simulations is something very different because it's a distribution logic. It will have value in terms of when you think about controlling how you would distribute this as an architectural system, right? So that's really like the conversation between something that is more behavior-based and let's call it agent-based versus the parametric conversation that we were talking about. But for right now, what I'm saying is that the agent-based strategies is a distribution and a way of disseminating a strategy of self-organization, which is a parallel research to thinking about water as phenomena. Mm. And one is working in terms of a system of distribution. Potentially that would be introducing the things that would actually stimulate these different phenomena states, right? Because it would be more about the control system of your architectural project than the kind of simulation of a phenomenon. So that's my only point, that I think the Boyd's principles and all of that stuff, those things are going to be really organizational, driven from a kind of, let's call it architectural approach to how those things are distributed. But in terms of the phase changing and all of these things that I see, I think it's important. I think in some ways, I think it would be really useful that you guys explore those different states with the same terms so that you can basically exhibit, from the bond strategy between things that are more loose particles to things that are very tightly packed. You can demonstrate those things. And to use the engines to kind of speak to that phenomenon a little bit more directly. At the moment, this would be the abstraction of bonds. At some moment in time, it should be about distribution of formation. So that's why I see the snowflake as a very easy example to say, well, it's very clear that there is a boundary of limitation of growth, and a snowflake has a certain kind of serial repetition, but they're not the same. It's not a duplication. So there are very particular constraints that make something a snowflake and not a piece of ice. And I think that these also are working at different scales. So I think it's potentially pretty fascinating that you can work in all of these different scales just on its own, and then also have the possibility to work on all of the phase change, which is the way that these things are communicating in between. So mentioning to the diagram that Daphne was talking through before about water's relationship as something adaptive and all of these things, I think just focus on the material right now would be my recommendation, to see to see what opportunities we can look at for that. And then the relationship to the container and to all of these other things we can introduce, and we will introduce later, because those will be part of our control mechanisms, right? Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah,
Meaning like
we were at
all of
the point of trying to find how to, which is the computational frame that can express the phase change and the different phases of water. So, for example, this was very, very rough representation with Maya particle, like only trying to represent the different attraction and collision and collision radius between particles. So it's obvious that we have different attraction in different phases, and stronger bonds or less strong bonds between particles. So we thought that we could represent that in that way, but it's not. It seems that it's not enough, because it's very.
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. It's not enough solely at that scale, because there's a high degree of abstraction, because what we're talking about is just the densification of particles as bonds. When you scale it up to things that become more legible, where you start to see formal features being exhibited, like I go back to the snowflake, where it's very clear that pattern is something that's legible. Or when we look at something like the icebergs are interesting because iceberg is not necessarily singular. Icebergs are usually plural. It's a kind of ecosystem of almost like artificial islands. What's interesting about that is also the difference between the growth that's outside, that's in the volume of air, versus the growth that's below, which usually the relationship is almost 1/3 to 2/3 in terms of how those things are floating and mass and all of that stuff. So there's so many complex things, but I think what's important is the simulative capacity to think about how those things now at a different scale have a different kind of strategy of pattern that become legible, or formation becomes legible. Snowflake generator, like the vapor cloud logic, and you introduce environment and how it's influencing, then you start to see where those differences really start to make a difference. So I think just try to work within those kind of constraints, and let's see how we go in a week, and we can review that. But I think it's helpful to kind of keep that, water as phenomenon slide as the real matrix that you're looking at. Is that okay?
Yep.
And the flocking and all of those other things, I think those things should continue to be worked on. But I think leave that direct correlation with how is that working with water and stuff like that, because it's a different kind of question. It's really talking about an agent-based strategy. Like at some moment you may say like, okay, well, we want to make an intelligent cloud. Like let's just say it from my perspective right now. Let's say you're like Theo doing his Theo stuff. And you say, okay, water is the material, but if I say, well, okay, now how is water an intelligent agent-based system? You would have to say, well, Okay, that water droplet or whatever has to have the capacity to take decisions. So a particle would be very clear that based on temperature, this or that, it will change from one passive state to another one, but that's stimulated between chemical bonds, all of that. But if we want to say, well, how does this water shape itself from here to go from something that's amorphous into something that we want to shape as a blob or something else, we would have to say that those water droplets would need to come together and assemble in a particular way, right? It's like, I don't know if you've ever watched Terminator, when you get that like silver kind of creature, bad guy thing that's becoming into a human and then morphing into fluid. It's kind of like what would make those water droplets come together to generate something that had a very different form of behavior. It's that kind of stuff. So that's where the agency will start to ask maybe more design strategies of thinking about how those things can take decisions. Even thinking that water droplets, let's say, for example, when I showed you the rain room, if we said every one of those water droplets had some agency, we would have to design that water droplet as something, not just a water droplet. We would have to design that consistency of release of water or the internal pressurization of something for it to have those features, right? And this is where then imagination has to come in. And what does it mean? What's a droplet? Is it just a piece of water with certain surface tension? Or are we designing the container? I don't know if you've ever seen these edible water bottles. Have you seen this stuff? Where people are just basically selling this, it's basically using water as a container and you can eat water basically. Well, I think that's kind of interesting. You don't have the plastic containers and all of those things. And you're using this water-soluble kind of strategies to think about the container of a certain amount of fluid. That's different than, let's say, water kind of floating in the NASA example, which will become a sphere because of the surface tension of its internal pressures. So what I'm saying is, like, it's good to keep developing this work, but just don't try to have an artificial connection to the simulation water phenomenon stuff. And we'll come up with an interesting idea for this thing. But give that some time for us to think about what that stuff will be, okay? Come on, it could be super exciting. We're already thinking about stuff, which I think is cool.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. I'm just very confused about how we should develop further the computational part. I mean, we are going, so not to focus on such small particle populations only.
I think you should take that. I think the small population, I think, is good, but that's closer to the way that you are demonstrating those bond relationships, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one track. If you only leave it there, these are not going to show so many meaningful differences, right? So if you take it to a different scale, like what makes a snowflake, and what makes an iceberg different from a snowflake, I think then if you tick all three of those, then the spaces between all of those will show different formational attributes at different scales. It's almost like zooming the camera into something very detailed that's happening at the cellular level, zooming out, seeing the organs, zooming out, seeing the body. So I think that's the way that I would approach this problem. So I think the goal should be on the 11th of March to be able to hit all of these. And, if you can't hit all of them, that's fine. But I think the attempt should be to try to do that. And we can go quite deep into any one of those things. And if we see that one of them is super exciting and is giving us a lot of potential, then we could focus on that. But I think at the moment, the exciting part is to try to understand these differences and to try to find a methodology with the tools that can help us communicate some of that better. Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful just to show that diagram and say, like, this is the diagram that, so for example, like, how do you communicate this with Mustafa? How do you communicate it with other people? I think that diagram for me is just super clear. Now the question is, how do we use the tools to somehow show that? So the tool may be consistent across, but maybe not vertically down. And these are kinds of strategies that you guys can look at by just exploring the tools and the ways that you're using, the language of translation, right? Some things can be much better in terms of a low population of particles to exhibit more of the bonds. But when we start to go into fluid dynamics or some of these other things, different ways of representation are there. This is where you guys have to try and try and try again, and we'll see how it goes. There's not a linear way of doing this, but I think that there's a clear framework to do that, and I think that diagram does that for you guys. So it's a good diagram, that's all I'm saying. Even if it's not a diagram, it's just a clear way of strategizing those things with very clear kind of language. I don't know what an iceberg really is. You're going to show me, because you're going to generate them. You're going to show me a taxonomy of iceberg generations. What makes something grow as an iceberg in one particular formation or another? Because that's basically like, how is ice being shaped without a container? Which is very different than creating, like an ice tray and having ice cubes at the end of the day. We know what that translation is. We know the volumetric difference between ice and water. All of those things are properties, but those are not giving us an idea of how formation is being influenced by environment. Okay, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries, guys. How are the rest of the kids, as they say? Do the other two teams want to share something, or would they prefer not to? Do you guys want to answer me or not?
Sorry, our team knows that all of us are very tired